Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. The Chronicles of Murtana Archolos is a total conversion mod for Gothic 2 which came out in late 2021. I really can't believe it's been so long because I remember when it came out and I had plans to do a full review close to the release. I even streamed the game for a couple of times, but then I started doing something else and I never returned to it. So I finally decided to sit down and beat the entire game. First of all, calling Archolos a mod is kinda disrespectful because it's basically a standalone game which happens to use Gothic's 2 engine. The story and the setting are still related to Gothic's universe though. Gothic 2 is an epic RPG which came out in 2002 and the developers of this total conversion are obviously huge fans. Poland has a lot of Gothic fans, so it's not a surprise that such project came out from this European country. I heard so many good things about this game, up to the point where I started thinking that people are over-exaggerating a little bit. But after beating the game, I have to say that Archolos is hands down one of the best games that I played in recent memory. It's not without its problems though, and it's certainly not perfect, but despite that, I had a really fun time with the game in general. Now let's talk about all major features of the game, starting with the visuals and the technical side of things. Archolos requires you to have Gothic 2 Gold on Steam or GOG because this is how almost every total conversion for a game works. It's completely free if you have the original game, and it also works out of the box on modern PCs. I was running the game in 4K, although I did have some very annoying stutters until I tweaked some graphical settings. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough to entirely fix this micro-stuttering issue, so I just gave up after a while. Archolos is pushing this old game engine to its limits, and it seems like the original game was never meant to have so many NPCs on the screen at once and such dense areas, especially in the city itself. I don't know what I'm talking about because I'm not a game developer, but one thing is for sure, my experience wasn't that smooth, and my PC should have been able to handle this game with no issues on the highest settings. Maybe it's the 4K resolution, I don't know, but it's certainly worth mentioning. Archolos is obviously looking pretty outdated by today's standards, but like I said before, it's using a very old game engine called Zenjin. However, these guys tried to improve the game engine as much as possible. I'm pretty sure they're using the mod for implementing DirectX 12 in the game, which is obvious by looking at the rain and lighting in the game. It's much improved compared to the original Gothic 2, but that's not the only graphical improvements. There are a lot of new assets in the game, and this is a brand new open world map on an entirely new islands. Those are not graphical improvements per se, but it makes the game feel fresh and new despite the old engine. Putting that aside, let's talk about the actual game, starting with the story and quests. You play as a character named Marvin, which is funny because in Gothic games Marvin was a synonym for cheats, and by typing Marvin you would enable the game console. Marvin and his brother Jorn are driven away from their home by the war, which has been looming over the horizon. They find themselves on the ship that's headed for Archolos with a bunch of other like-minded people. This is where the game actually begins, and it's like a mini tutorial. All of you get forced to swim to the shore because it turns out that pirates are assholes. Yeah, imagine that. Even in this short little introduction, Archolos has a couple of interesting choices that you have to make. This trend continues throughout the whole game, and the consequences of your decisions are impactful and really well done in general. Even when it comes to very simple side quests and activities, it really took me by surprise how good this aspect of the game is. Here's a quick example. There is a beggar in the city who asks you for some gold, and if you decide to give her some gold, the next time you explore this part of the city, she will ask for more. If you refuse a couple of times, she will return with a bunch of dogs to beat you up. This is not even a quest, as far as I can remember, it's just a scripted little interaction which can happen in this particular square of the city. You will likely even forget that you gave her some gold until it happens again when you happen to run by. And of course you can be a fool and give her gold every time you see her, and I will assume something completely different happens at the end. That's how almost all quests in the game work, and it really feels like all of your decisions have meaningful consequences on the world, the characters, and yourself. The city of Archolos is filled with small details like this, which makes the game world feel very much alive. Unfortunately, the main story itself has to be the weakest part of the game. It quickly turns into a big search mission when your brother disappears, and I was really hoping that won't be the main focus of the main story. Well, it's about 70% of it, which is still pretty bad. First of all, I found it really hard to care about this guy because you don't get to spend that much time with him anyway, and there are far more likable and interesting characters to meet throughout your journey. Pretty much all other characters you meet in the first 30 minutes of the game have more interesting personalities than your brother. Your quest log will get filled very fast, and you will probably forget about the missing brother until somebody mentions it again. Finding your brother felt like a simple plot device, which is supposed to get you in the mix of political intrigues in Archolos. This is the main reason why Marvin wants to meet every important character in Archolos, but most of them require you to do some serious busy work until you get to meet them. This is also where the game pays homage to Gothic 2 by giving the player a couple of different factions to join and progress through the ranks. You can either join the Merchants Guild or the Guards, but you can also become an apprentice in the city. This part of the game is simply amazing, and it even overshadows Gothic 2, but we'll talk about it more in the gameplay section. Another problem I have with the main story is the overarching plot, or the lack of it. The beginning of the game is very slow, which is not unusual for Gothic games. However, Archolos failed to make me care about pushing the main story forward and progressing to the game. It fails to motivate the player to keep playing the game because there is no strong reason to do so, from the narrative side of things at least. But of course, all Gothic 2 fans probably won't care about this because they don't need a strong reason to enjoy such gameplay, especially if the gameplay itself is good old Gothic 2 with a bunch of improvements. Don't get me wrong, I was enjoying the gameplay from the very beginning because Archolos manages to capture the spirit of Gothic games in a huge way, and even more than that. Gothic 2 gave you a pretty decent incentive to continue pushing the story forward and finding out how the nameless hero fits into it. On the other side, the writing in Archolos is very well done, and almost every single quest is unique and interesting. The voice acting seems pretty good as well, but I can't judge these aspects of the game properly because I don't speak Polish.
Marvin, to nie we mnie powinieneś celować.
Niby dlaczego?
Przyszedłem tutaj w tym samym celu co ty, Pojorna. I paru innych ludzi. Znalazłeś kogoś żywego?
There is no English voiceover, but we have the subtitles, which is more than enough to enjoy this game if you ask me. Finding your brother felt just like an excuse for the game to put you in the mix of political intrigues, which are far more interesting than the main story itself. This is where the game brings back some very well-known features from Gothic 2, like having to choose between a couple of different factions in order to progress through the ranks and become an actual citizen. Just like in Gothic 2, you get to unlock a special upper part of the city after a while, but this didn't feel that important like in Gothic 2. Although that doesn't matter a lot because the city itself is very impressive. You'll spend a lot of time in the city doing various quests and activities, and it was really overwhelming at first. I really struggled to memorize the locations of districts, but you can even hire some NPCs to take you where you need to go for some money. This is also how the fast travel system works in the game, and it's very intuitive actually. To go back to the main story, we have 6 full-blown chapters in the game. The last chapter is shorter, which is not that unusual, but most chapters are pretty damn long. Almost all chapters have something unique going on, and it keeps the game fresh from the very beginning to the very end. You'll constantly meet new and interesting characters, and most of them are very memorable because of the good writing and the quests they can give you. There is an abundance of dialogue and recorded speech, which can easily rival some much newer RPGs. It's a shame because I know for a fact that a lot of people won't get to experience this game because it looks old and it requires some previous knowledge about the Gothic series. You don't have to play previous Gothic games to play Archolos, but I would highly recommend doing so because you'll learn to appreciate this game a lot more. Anyway, I really like the dialogue and most characters in the game, but I also think Archolos has some slight problems with the pacing. That's mostly because some characters can go on a long tangent in dialogue without saying anything particularly interesting or useful, they just like to talk. The way that some quests were designed also feel like they were just trying to artificially extend the game time for whatever reason. I already mentioned that quests are mostly amazing in the game because almost all of them are unique and interesting. But I was kinda frustrated a couple of times while doing some quests because they felt needlessly long and tedious. For example, you have to do a couple of pretty long quests before you get to enter the mines in chapter 4 because you have to prove the Wolf Sons that you're not going to die down there. So all of a sudden these assholes care about your well-being. It doesn't make any sense at all. Why would the leader care about if you die or not in the mines? Because in the best case scenario, you'll manage to save some of his people down there, and if you die, who cares? You also need to do some stupid quests to get a couple of guards to guard the entrance of the mine. Like mine crawlers are suddenly going to try and escape the mines. Every guard has its own little quest you have to do before he accepts to guard the mine. Like I said, it's a bit tedious and stupid, especially if you start thinking about it for a second. There are a couple of situations like this in the game where quests can feel more like obstacles and hoops you have to jump through without believable explanation. To put it simply, the quests have a very methodical design where you need to do more than a couple of things before you do the actual thing you need to do. For the most part, the game gives you a good enough reason for doing these quests because of the good writing and interesting characters. But sometimes it can feel very systematic and gamey, for the lack of a better term. On the other side, this game has some quests which are going to stick with me for a very, very long time. For example, the quest where you need to hunt down a mysterious beast that's been terrorizing the farmers and local people. The atmosphere that this quest creates and the mystery behind it was top notch.
Łowcy najwyraźniej próbowali się wspomóc jakąś magią.
It starts with a big hunting group that's gathering in the nearby tavern, and as with every other quest, you have some important choices to make which directly affects the outcome of the quest. This forest area was perfect for the quest location, and I was extremely impressed with how this quest was designed. Yeah, this quest was mind-blowing, and I found out there is even more depth to it when I went on the internet. I'm not going to spoil anything, but if you play the game, keep that in mind. Or how about gathering a strong army of characters for some serious dungeon crawling? It's a quest in the very late game, and it makes you think about all characters you met so far, and choosing who to bring to this expedition felt pretty important. Not just from the narrative side of things, but from the gameplay side as well, because stronger characters will be much, well, stronger and useful in this situation. This is where the game truly shines, with its story and gameplay when they seamlessly overlap in a logical way. Archolos also likes to break the monotony of doing regular quests by putting the player in some unpredictable situations, like being captured and having to do some quests to escape a dangerous cave, or having to learn how to survive amongst a bunch of pirates. While this is certainly appreciated and it keeps the game fresh, it also makes it feel a bit too scripted. That's not fundamentally bad, and it definitely improves the storytelling in some segments. However, it also includes some trial and error quests, which is not exactly in the spirit of Gothic games. For example, you can get executed in some scenarios if you choose the wrong dialogue option, or if you didn't do the quest in a way the developers intended.
To w zasadzie bez
Gothic games would at least give you a chance to defend yourself in these kinds of situations and not just kill you in a scripted event. I joined the guards in this playthrough, which is one of the major factions in Archolos. By progressing through the ranks and doing quests for the guards, you also unlock the access for the upper city and some important characters in the game like Governor, Volker and Ulrich. Even though finding your brother is technically the main mission in the game, the quests you take from these characters can also be described as such. The story really kicks off when you start investigating the murder attempt on Volker. But the game is not meant to be played by religiously following one quest line until the very end. Most of the quest lines will overlap each other, so you have to do a little bit of everything. Like I said, it can be a bit overwhelming at first, but you can just play the game at your own pace, it's not a big deal. You'll probably miss a lot of quests on your first playthrough, but that only makes the replay value even stronger. Archolos has a bunch of funny quests as well, like I mentioned before. How about this guy who makes wolf sounds with a wolf mask on top of the hill, because, well, they are wolf sons.
Au! Au!
Zgłupiałeś? Co ty wyrabiasz? Dlaczego wy...
Jestem prawdziwym wilczym synem. Oh!
There is a quest where you have to sabotage the old Gothic 2 armor shipment because people are basically clowning the guards for wearing them. These kinds of quests are silly but well designed, and like I said, they will stick with me for a very long time. Overall, the main story and side content in Archolos is more than enough to keep you interested in the game until the very end, and even more than that. The choices and consequences make the replay value of the game very strong. You'll easily spend over 60 hours into one playthrough, and a lot more if you're trying to see everything that the game has to offer. The gameplay in Archolos is basically Gothic 2 on steroids, for the most part. I beat the entire game with a classic two-handed melee build, with occasionally using a crossbow. The melee combat is pretty much identical to Gothic 2, but the game has some new enemy types and even bosses. Some of these boss fights are not very good, to be honest, but I'm very glad they even tried to make them work. The boss fights in Gothic 2 were not very good as well. Archolos tries to modernize the boss fights with a big HP bar that you can see in Souls-like games, but they also have some new mechanics that we could see for the first time ever. The bosses usually have a couple of different mechanics that you have to worry about, and not all of them are fun, but I still like them in general. Even human NPCs have some brand new moves in combat, which took me by surprise. Some serious effort has been made to improve the big fights in the game, and I respect these guys a lot for even trying to do something like this. Check out this new ninja move, which swipes you off your feet. It's janky as all hell, but it's pretty cool to see new mechanics in Gothic 2 combat. It's not just about bosses, some regular enemies have special animations in combat which are more telegraphed. Gothic 2 melee combat had some very fast and unpredictable attacks. Archolos added some brand new attacks to NPCs, especially in early parts of the game when you get into fights with multiple enemies. These attacks are much easier to dodge or block, and it makes fighting multiple enemies a bit more enjoyable. I feel like they could have used the same design philosophy later in the game. And to be fair, they do use the same mechanics in a lot of fights with multiple enemies, but I wish they used it even more. There is one part in the main campaign where I was almost completely stuck. You can probably avoid this from happening if you choose the right dialogue options. But even so, when you have to fight them, it's very hard to handle so many enemies at once in a regular melee fight. Having at least a couple of these NPCs use the new, more telegraphed attacks would probably help a lot, without making the fight a lot easier. Anyway, if you're new to Gothic games, the combat has a simple combo system for melee attacks. The combo system changes and improves when you start investing leveling up points into your desirable weapon style. You get completely new animations for attacks, and the whole combat system becomes much snappier. This might seem very alien in modern game design because the game is purposely making the combat experience much worse than it's supposed to be in order to enhance the feeling of character progression later on. Speaking of which, the progression system in Archolos is arguably even better than in Gothic 2. We got some brand new features on top of old Gothic 2 gameplay design, which feels like they should have been in the game from the very beginning. There are more armors and weapons to get by progressing through the ranks of the faction or by buying them from some specific merchants. You can also get them from crafting, of course. More than 100 new armors and weapons to be more precise, which is kinda crazy. The economy is much tighter in this game, and I always find myself lacking some gold for what I want to buy. Getting new armor was always a huge deal in Gothic games, and Archolos is no different. You need to progress through the ranks in the faction in order to get some better gear. But this time around, it feels like you have a lot more options to acquire new armors and weapons without diminishing the feeling of progression through the ranks of your faction. I also love how you can upgrade some armor sets with the guards, and it comes with visual changes as well. The process of joining the faction was pretty fun as well. You get to do some busy work and things you would expect to do as a guard in the city, but they always include an interesting twist to these simple quests to make them more interesting. Even some side characters you get to meet have something going on for them, which makes them memorable. You're not the only guy who is progressing through the ranks. You'll see regular soldiers get new armors, as well as your friends in the guards. That's a minor attention to detail, but it makes the game even more immersive, and it only goes to show you how much effort the Archolos team has put into the game. I didn't get to test out the magic gameplay yet, but I think I wouldn't like it that much. There is no mage guild in the game that you can join, and magic gameplay progression in Archolos has RNG aspects. I really can't speak in depth about it, but I'm not a huge fan of RNG progression systems. You can find some mages in the city, and there are some important quests related to them, as well as the paladins. However, you basically have to find or buy new books with circles of magic in order to learn new spells. I'm pretty sure that's how it works. Having another faction that's related to mages was probably too much to ask for, so even including the magic playstyle is highly appreciated. It seems like they had plans to include another faction related to mages, because they already had almost everything they need in the game for that to happen. I also can't remember fighting a lot of mage NPCs in the game, so having magic resistances on armor is kinda pointless. The beginning of the game is very well done. The village of Silbak does a great job with introducing the player to most major features in the game. You can spend a lot of hours in this starting zone because there are plenty of quests to do. There are multiple paths that you can take from the village, and you'll quickly learn where not to go. You can easily get one-shotted by some enemies, and that's the game's way of telling you where not to go until you get stronger. It's a simple yet very effective way of creating a strong sense of progression, because it feels very satisfying once you finally manage to defeat those stronger enemies. This is something that Gothic games always did so well, and it makes the character progression very meaningful further down the line. As a matter of fact, I think Archolos does a better job with this than Gothic 2, but it's been a while since I completed the Gothic 2 playthrough, so maybe it's just recency bias. The real game begins when you get to the city of Archolos. The map itself is very well done in general. It has a lot of vertical exploration and secrets to find behind every corner. The developers have made sure to put something behind every corner, even when you don't expect it. I can't remember the last time when I had more fun with exploration in RPGs, so that should tell you everything you need to know how I feel about this. The exploration was very fun, and I couldn't wait to level up a bit so I can explore more areas. The map is much bigger than I expected, but I'm not sure how big it is compared to Gothic 2. It's not small by any means, and the distance between populated areas felt perfect to me. There are just enough things to see in between these areas, and most of the map is used for some specific quests. There are some very dangerous areas which you have to avoid as a low level character, but even when you level up a lot, you'll still find some very challenging enemies, like orcs. Speaking of orcs, they are not used that much in this game, but that's fine by me. Archolos tries to tell its own story, not related to paladins, mages or orcs. There are some quests in the game which are related to them, but they are certainly not the main focus. The main focus would be the city of Archolos and the politics behind it. So let's talk a little bit more about the city of Archolos. There are many different districts in the city, with an impressive amount of NPCs on the screen at once. According to the Steam page, there are around 200 random events which can happen, and I completely believe this. Literally every time you explore the city, you can experience something different. Although they went a bit crazy with random fights which can happen with crazy NPCs, which were especially annoying in the early game when you can't deal a lot of damage. It's not just about random fights, you'll frequently get interrupted by NPCs who are offering you some quest to do, or it's just a little simple event like the one with the beggar that I mentioned before. I really can't stress enough how fun some of these random events are. All of this makes the city of Archolos a living and breathing open world. It's very impressive. Combined with amazing quest design, Archolos creates some very memorable gameplay moments throughout the whole game. Most NPCs will remember what you did in the past, and they react appropriately in dialogue. Besides the surface level exploration, we also have some dungeon crawling in the game. Not only small dungeons that you can stumble upon and get some loot by killing enemies, there are a couple of bigger dungeons in the game. Like the mine I mentioned before, which is dark as all hell. You really need a spell or a torch to see what's going on here. But it manages to create an amazing atmosphere in general. Archolos has a sewer system as well, which acts as a dungeon for a specific quest. This was a cool quest, but it's probably the weakest dungeon in the game. The dungeon near the end of the game where you have to get a special artifact reminds me of how dungeons in the first Risen game were designed. There are multiple puzzles to solve in order to progress through the rooms, and even some bosses to kill. The process of getting a large group of people in order to even do this dungeon properly is very well done, like I said before. The progression in this dungeon can be described as wide rather than deep. You're not exactly going deeper in the dungeon, you're just unlocking more rooms from all sides, which has some shortcuts to the beginning area. It feels good for the most part, but I think they overused a very annoying enemy type in some of these rooms. I hate fighting the stone gargoyles, it's not fun at all as a melee character. The game expects you to play this quest with a bunch of other people you met throughout your journey, but even the strongest NPC you bring with you will probably die very fast. So you're on your own for the most part anyway. Maybe I just didn't hire strong enough people, I don't know, but the dungeon became kinda annoying close to the ends. Nevertheless, I think this dungeon design is pretty good in general and it felt appropriate for the endgame. Archolos wasn't afraid to experiment a bit with some of the quests in the main story, and they did a wonderful job with the variety of quests you get to do. They did a great job with the presentation as well, which we couldn't see in Gothic 2 a lot. Things like different camera pans in important situations, mini cutscenes, and some great set pieces, which I'm not going to spoil of course. Although some of these scenes were not impactful enough because of the weak main story, but still, they're impressive nonetheless. Marvin as a character was much better than I expected. He's not exactly a completely blank character because he has some backstory which affects the main story itself. That never got in the way of making important decisions in the game, which will shape his personality in the way you see fit. It's similar to Elex games where you have Jax as the main character, but you still have the complete control over his decisions. I personally would prefer a completely blank character like the Nameless Hero, but I liked Marvin a lot more than I expected. As for the new gameplay features, Archolos included some basic material gathering for making arrows and bolts, a new crafting and alchemy system, along with some improvements to cooking meals. You can also improve some armor pieces if you visit a certain NPC in the city. I didn't mess around with these systems a lot, but from what I managed to see, they certainly improved the depth of the gameplay. Pretty much all shops in the city, and there are plenty of them, are not just there to make the city look bigger and for cosmetic reasons. There are either some quests related to them, or you can do some simple activities, like selling gold coins that you can find throughout the whole world. I also like how you can fail some of these quests in the game, and you can clearly see the repercussions of those actions later on. For example, this store will shut down if you fail the quest. I can't stress enough how good these quests are in the game. The developers went above and beyond to make them as interesting as possible. Archolos is another proof that creating a more vertical, smaller open world with dense locations is quite possibly the best way to design an open world RPG. And that's coming from someone who also likes huge open worlds in games for different reasons. The music in the game has some new tracks, and they mixed it up with the old tracks from Gothic 2. I'm pretty sure I heard some similar music to Gothic 3 as well. Music in these games was always a huge deal, and without these amazing tracks, the game wouldn't be nearly as immersive as it was. Archolos is basically a love letter to old Gothic fans. It's a full-blown game that could have been a direct sequel to Gothic 2. It does some things better than Gothic 2 and some things worse, but it also tries to do its own thing for the most parts. I wouldn't necessarily compare those two games because it's not even fair. Gothic 2 came out almost 22 years ago, and Piranha Bytes created one of the best RPGs ever with limited resources. Archolos team did an outstanding job as well, there is no doubt about it. But to answer the question from the beginning, no, I don't think Archolos is better than Gothic 2 in general, even though a lot of fans think the opposite. Unfortunately, Archolos has a couple of barriers to entry. The lack of English voice acting is probably the biggest issue for most people, even though there are English subtitles. This might be a hot take, but I think developers made a huge mistake with focusing on Polish voice acting. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad the game even has full voice acting, but I think Archolos could have reached even more people if there was English voice acting. That's just my opinion, but despite this, Archolos managed to reach some impressive numbers on Steam. If you miss out on this RPG just because of these reasons I mentioned, you'll miss out on one of the best RPGs in recent years. Trust me, I'm not over-exaggerating. Archolos is an amazing RPG, and I'll definitely replay it in the future when I start playing Gothic Trilogy again. 2.0 version is supposed to come out in the near future, and it's going to have a lot new content like quests, items, random events, and changes to the game world map and game balance, along with the optional hardcore mode, which I definitely intend to try out. Anyway, tell me your thoughts about Archolos in the comments below.
Oh!
I know it's a well-beloved game in the Gothic community, and it has an overwhelmingly positive reviews on Steam for a reason. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed the video. You can also support me by becoming a YouTube member or a Patreon. I also have some cool t-shirts and hoodies in the theme of the channel, so check that out as well. Huge thanks to all of my current supporters, and I'll see you in the next one.